The CIA secretly dosed people with hallucinogenics. The US military drew up plans to stage attacks on American citizens. The Navy sprayed bacteria over an entire city. Thousands of soldiers became test subjects, and government scientists collected human tissue without families ever knowing. None of these are conspiracy theories. They all happened. Most conspiracy theories fall apart the moment you start digging. These didn't, because eventually the files were opened and they were even worse than people imagined. Tonight we're looking at 5 government experiments that were hidden decades before the truth finally came out. Let's start with the one most people have actually heard of, MKUltra. In 1953, the CIA launched one of the most infamous secret programs in American history. Officially, they wanted to understand mind control. Unofficially, they started experimenting on human beings. The Cold War was in full swing. American intelligence believed hostile nations might already be developing techniques to control prisoners, spies, or even politicians. So the CIA decided they needed to find out first. The problem was, they didn't always ask permission. People were secretly given hallucinogenic substances, some in hospitals, some in prisons, some in universities. Some didn't even know they were taking part in an experiment. One of the strangest offshoots became known as Operation Midnight Climax, and yes, I know what you're thinking, and yes, the CIA rented apartments and adult liaison venues, is what I'll say politely, then secretly watched people through two-way mirrors after they had been unknowingly dosed with hallucinogenics. Imagine waking up the next morning thinking you'd just had the weirdest night of your entire life, only to find out decades later the CIA had been taking notes. When public investigations finally began in the 1970s, the CIA ordered most of the MKUltra files to be destroyed. Thousands of records disappeared forever. The only reason we know as much as we do today is because some financial documents were accidentally stored in the wrong place and survived. Without that mistake, MKUltra might still be dismissed as nothing more than a conspiracy theory, but it wasn't. It was real.
They wrote them down. Humans are terrifying.
I know 85, they always write it down.
Mate, that's either arrogance or paperwork addiction.
Yeah, usually both, mate. And somehow, it only gets worse from here. If MKUltra asked, how far will the government go in secret? Operation Northwoods answered, further. It was 1962. The Cold War was getting colder. The failed Bay of Pigs invasion had embarrassed the United States, and military leaders wanted another chance to remove Fidel Castro from power. There was just one problem. The American public would never support another invasion without a reason, so military planners came up with one. Or rather, they planned to create one. The proposal suggested staging attacks against American targets and blaming Cuba. Among the ideas were fake acts of terrorism, explosions, hijackings, even creating fake casualty lists to convince the public that innocent Americans had been unalived. Not because those attacks had happened, but because they wanted people to believe they had. Yeah, read that again. They weren't reacting to an attack, they were discussing how to manufacture one. The plan was presented to senior military leaders, and remarkably, the bloody signed it. Today, the declassified documents still exist, page after page, outlining scenarios that sound more like the plot of a political thriller than official military planning. Fortunately, there was one person who refused to approve it: President John F. Kennedy. Without his rejection, Operation Northwoods might never have become declassified curiosity. it might have become history. And that's perhaps the most disturbing part. Not that someone had the idea, ideas are cheap, it's that senior officials wrote it down, passed it around, discussed it, and bloody signed it, as if it were just another item on the agenda. Because once something is written down inside an official file, it stops being internet folklore, it becomes evidence. By September 1950, the Cold War had created new fear, not bombs, biological weapons. What would happen if an enemy released deadly bacteria over an American city? The military wanted an answer, so instead of running a simulation, they ran an experiment. The US Navy sailed just off the coast of San Francisco. Yeah, San Francisco, for several days. They released bacteria into the air. The idea was simple: use the city's famous fog to see how far a biological attack could spread. There was just one problem. Nobody living in San Francisco knew it was happening. Imagine waking up, going to work, taking the kids to school, walking the dog, completely unaware that your own government was using your city as a science experiment. Military scientists believed that the bacteria they were releasing was harmless, but not everyone agreed that was the outcome. Shortly afterwards, 11 patients at local hospitals developed rare infections. One man, Edward Nevin, later died. His family believed the government's experiment was responsible. Officials denied any direct connection. The debate continues today. But what's not debated is that the experiment happened. The documents confirm it. The ships were there. The bacteria was released. The city was never warned.
He used fog as a delivery system.
Yeah, that was the idea, mate.
On my planet, that's how you lose the planet.
I know, mate. Probably won't be doing ours any good either. And sea spray wasn't the only one. It was just one experiment in a much larger program, studying how biological agents could spread across populated areas. Sea spray experimented on the public. Edgewood Arsenal experimented on people sworn to protect them. For nearly 3 decades, thousands of American soldiers arrived at military facility in Maryland believing they were helping their country, and in a way they were. They just didn't know exactly how. At Edgewood Arsenal, volunteers took part in classified military research. Some were exposed to powerful hallucinogenics, others to nerve agents, chemical weapons, experimental compounds. The military wanted to understand how these substances affected the human body and the human mind. Some soldiers knew they were taking part in experiments. Few understood what they were actually being exposed to. Imagine signing up to your country and years later discovering that you were part of a weapons experiment. That's a different kind of battlefield. Many participants later described terrifying hallucinations, memory problems, psychological trauma. Some reported health issues they believed followed them for the rest of their lives. And because so much of the program remained classified, proving what had happened became incredibly difficult. For years, many veterans struggled to get recognition, not because the experiments hadn't happened, but because the paperwork remained locked away. Eventually, more information began to emerge. The program had been real. Thousands of service personnel had taken part, and while researchers argued the work was vital during the Cold War, many veterans argued they had never truly understood what they were agreeing to, which leaves one final file. By the 1950s, above ground nuclear tests had spread radioactive fallout across the world. Governments needed to know one thing: how much of the radiation was finding its way into the human body. The answer became Project Sunshine. Officially, it was a scientific study. Unofficially, it had crossed a line that many people believe should never have been crossed. Researchers wanted to measure radioactive elements inside human bones, especially strontium-90, a substance created during nuclear explosions, so they began collecting human tissue, including the remains of infants and young children, in many cases without the knowledge or consent of their families. Just let that sink in for a second. Families buried the children, never knowing parts of their remains had been removed for scientific research. The project eventually collected thousands of samples from around the world, hospitals, universities, medical institutions, all feeding into one classified program. The research confirmed what scientists feared. Radioactive fallout wasn't staying in the atmosphere, it was entering the food chain and eventually the human body. The science itself helped improve our understanding of nuclear contamination, but the way that knowledge was obtained was deeply controversial ever since, because the question was never whether radiation was dangerous. The question was, how far should any government be allowed to go in the name of national security? So there they are, 5 government programs that sound like conspiracy theories but weren't. A secret mind control program, a proposal to stage attacks on American citizens, an entire city used as a biological test, thousands of soldiers exposed to experimental chemicals, and a classified project collected human tissue without families ever knowing. Now, these weren't rumours, these weren't internet myths, they were real programs that we later uncovered through official investigations, declassified records and historical reporting. And that's exactly why they matter, because history has a habit of reminding us that governments are made up of people who make good decisions, people who make terrible decisions, and sometimes people who convince themselves the end justifies almost anything. The unsettling part isn't that these programs existed, it's that for years many people who talked about them were dismissed as conspiracy theorists until the files began to appear. If these are the secrets that eventually became public, what is still sitting behind the classified stamp today? Let me know which one shocked you the most, or if there's another documented government experiment that you think deserves its own episode. I'm doing one from the UK because we were just as bad. That will be in a few weeks' time. Stay curious. Shane out.